So Secretary Moniz, I was thinking about all the times where we've chatted. I think we had an interview in Las Vegas, we've had one in Morocco for the UN Climate Conference, and now here we are online. So that's a first. I have some questions for you about the bigger picture on the climate change debate, but then also some really tied to this pandemic that we're in today. So for my first question, how do you think this pandemic will affect the big picture on climate change and action for it, which had been growing before the virus had hit?
Well, I think there are clearly some very short-term effects that are massive. We can see that right now, given our mode of discussion here. And certainly for the energy sector, the enormous demand reduction, as you know, is roiling the energy industry. But I mean, frankly, I see no reason structurally why we're not going to return to a demand situation. We will need different kinds of jobs in the economy, and that's where I would make a primary link to your question. Namely, in my view, we're not going to simply replace all the workers we had in the same jobs. We're going to have to create new jobs. So a real question is, as we dig ourselves out of the economic hole, how should we use resources that create jobs, but also align with our future priorities? My argument is energy, the clean energy transition is a primary opportunity to do that. Again, the data, and we have produced, along with the state energy offices, the data on energy jobs in the United States, and we see that energy jobs in the early stages of the transition have been growing at the order of twice the rate of the economy as a whole. So in other words, this is a great opportunity to get the new jobs and to really give a kickstart to going even faster on the energy transition.
How confident, though, are you that Washington, Congress, and the Trump administration, that they will include an explicit support for clean energy jobs and things like that? It seems like that's what you're saying is needed, but I'm not seeing a lot of action on that front.
Well, clearly these first pieces of the overall stimulus have had to address the very immediate problems of getting some, frankly, money in people's hands, preserving jobs for small business and the like. That's completely understandable. Getting the state and city budgets at least somewhat improved, clearly. But I believe that as we move forward, I believe there is going to be some additional major stimulus. I believe that there will be more of a turn towards this question about how do we get the economy back in the large sense. And again, that was my argument. I think the energy industry, it may not be unique, but it's very important. I might add that it's not only for the climate imperative, but in addition, back in the Obama administration, the Department of Homeland Security declared 16 critical infrastructure sectors, sectors that if they were significantly impacted would affect the whole country. By the way, and public health is one of those, but energy and communications were the two that were singled out as the enablers for the rest. So for lots of reasons, for the economy, for security, for our low carbon future, this would be really a prime opportunity, I think, for accomplishing multiple goals.
You talked about the demand. I'm guessing you're talking at least partly about oil demand. And this is obviously tangential to Earth Day, but very relevant given oil is one of the big reasons that the Earth's temperature is rising. So the coronavirus is putting oil prices and the oil and gas industry itself into a historic tailspin. The implications for the environment in the near term are pretty clear. We're having clearer skies around the world. But long term, it seems a little bit murkier. So Secretary, do you think that this moment signals the beginning of the end for the oil industry? Or do you think it's just a really bust of the boom and bust cycle of the oil industry?
Well, first of all, the air is going to get less murky in the future, not more murky, as we go to to the low carbon future, which will also have the corollary of eliminating or vastly decreasing at least other pollutants. And I might add that obviously no one likes this pandemic and the economic dislocation that is resulting in that cleaner air that you referred to. But I just would, in my optimistic view, say this is only a glimpse of the benefits we will eventually have with a robust economy and a very, very low emissions economy. So, a little bit of putting out there the goal. Now, in terms of the oil business, clearly that's a major area of demand destruction, down probably 35%. Although I do want to emphasize electricity is also down, approaching 10%. As our residential use goes up a little bit, but our commercial and industrial use goes down a lot. But on the oil sector, there are some things that are being done. I won't go into it in detail, but things like the Department of Energy is using a play in terms of using the petroleum reserve, extra space, if you like, to take some oil off the market right now. Because the crash that you referred to is largely due to demand coupled with the exhaustion of storage space. But I think here we have a long-term secular change. It's clear, and in the long term, I would go back and connect this to the jobs issue again, because we can talk about the secular change in oil production and use over the next decades. And one might immediately say, well, there's an example of a major dislocation also of workers. Well, hopefully we can of course manage that. And in particular, one of the elements that I think is going to be very important in that low carbon future is building out a major carbon capture and sequestration business. That is going to draw upon the same kinds of skills that one has currently in the oil sector. So I think this is about managing this transition, going to low carbon, and seeing how the job structures in the country can draw upon the talents that we have. And when it can't, then we turn to people like our new partners, the AFL-CIO, with their tremendous apprenticeship programs, years of developing new skills in our workforce.
Right, and I want to ask about that in a moment, but just to finish up here on the oil front, I mean, do you think the oil industry is going to bounce back from this? Do you think it should bounce back? Or do you think all of these oil workers who are being laid off, should you just direct them to the carbon capture lane of jobs?
Well, look, I think, again, the transition is going to take longer than just bouncing back right now from this economic hole that we're in. I mean, look, I see no reason to doubt that we will see, the transportation sector rebound. Specifically, when we get out of our houses, we will start driving. We will increasingly be driving electric vehicles. But let's look at the numbers and just be honest about it. For example, we did a study about California's pathway to a 40% economy-wide reduction of emissions in 2030. The transportation sector in California is 40% of the emissions. So it's the long pole in the tent. When you look at California's aggressive goal to have 5 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030, I think they can do it. But that does not change the fact that today there are 30 million light-duty vehicles on the road in California, and in 2030, the projection is 35 million. So in other words, this transformation is going to take time. The EVs, for example, will certainly take off much more, even beyond 2030 and 2040, when, as you know, a number of countries are actually saying that we're only going to allow essentially zero carbon vehicles, zero emission vehicles after 2040. So it's going to take some time. There'll be a quick rebound as people get mobile again, but the secular change, I think, is occurring. I might add, electric vehicles certainly look to be the most promising right now for going to low carbon light duty vehicle emissions. But I wouldn't rule out that still, a breakthrough in advanced biofuels, other kinds of low carbon fuels, which can also be part of the mix.
But for me, it's hard for me to imagine people, many of whom are out of jobs and will be for, unfortunately, the foreseeable future. And with oil prices literally gone negative and gasoline prices cheaper than they've been in a decade or more, I don't see where, relatively speaking, more expensive electric vehicles will be the choice for many people. So I guess my question for you is that specific one, but also sort of bigger picture. I mean, the world is careening into a recession that some say could be worse than the Great Depression. So, typically we've seen in the past that when recessions hit, people's concern about the environment goes to the back burner. So why are you so optimistic that climate change action will remain moving as aggressively as it is, given the backdrop of our world today?
Well, first of all, I will be surprised if when the data are processed a few months down the road that we are not already in a significant recession. The question is, how long will that slope be to come out of that? Now, on the question of the EVs, I do think that, well, there are projections right now, particularly with, as you say, the extremely low oil and therefore gasoline prices, that the projections are for a slowdown in EV sales. But I personally think that it's going to be temporary. And the major point is that we are well on the road, and I would certainly say between 5 and 10 years away from the cost of ownership of an electric vehicle auto and a combustion engine auto being the same. A little bit of a difference still maybe in capital cost versus operating cost, but cost of ownership, I think, reaching parity in this decade for sure. And then when you add to that electric vehicles are really very fine performance cars, I think we're there to see a strong move in this direction.
Do you drive an electric car?
Not yet, but it will be my next one.
Well, some people say that the people will find private transportation, cars and such, to be more appealing than public transportation. Do you think that, after the pandemic, of course, do you think that the changes that are happening now, things like this, online events, and people's concern about being too close to people on the subway and things like that, I mean, do you think that could actually increase the demand for oil? Another example is plastic and its use in sending things through the mail. I got something today in the mail, and 3/4 of it was plastic packaging, which seemed incredibly wasteful. I mean, it seems like there could be a negative side to this even after we get out of the recession.
Well, look, again, there's going to be a complicated, very, very short-term dynamic here. I do not believe, and I don't underestimate that. And frankly, I think the views of this being kind of a V economic recovery are probably, it's going to be a kind of distorted V with one side going a lot longer out, I'm afraid. But long term here, I mean by 2030, I don't see any fundamental way that we are going to be deflected from going to this clean energy economy. For one thing, we are going to continue to see, unfortunately, an increase in natural events, hurricanes and fires and droughts and the like. I think the public is understanding much more than was the case certainly 10 years ago. This linkage to warming, to emissions, to the need to address this. and also the cost reductions. After all, look, in the United States, we have made significant carbon reductions without real national policy, and with roughly half of our states having things like, renewable portfolio standards and the like. But the reality is we've done quite a bit just in the evolution of the energy system. Now, this is going to continue now, I think, with further cost reductions for low carbon technologies. I do think that there's one area which has not been mentioned that does concern me about getting back on the track. Well, we have to get back on the track and then get on a new track because we weren't on a good enough track in terms of low carbon. We have to pick up the pace. But one of the implications of today's situation that does concern me going for the next years is that obviously we will have built up so much public debt that, and certainly if interest rates go up on that debt, it may be very difficult to find the kind of funding that I think we still should be investing in accelerating the low carbon transition. So,
could that build the case for carbon tax in Washington?
Well, I think carbon pricing is one thing that we will get, and we do need.
When do you think we'll get that? Do you have a time frame?
I will not mention my colleague's name. He is fairly well known, but I will soon be owing him at the end of this year some fine wine because I bet too early on the carbon tax. But I still think it will come soon. And
what was that bet that you lost?
Well, I bet that there would be economy-wide climate policy legislation by the end of 2020. This was made many years ago, and well, I'm not feeling bullish about the bet coming out. I'd love to see it happen, but we'll see. But the thing I'll say there, Amy, is another concern. That your implication that a carbon price might suddenly look more attractive as a way to work down the deficit is obviously understandable. For example, George Shultz, Jim Baker et al. Proposed starting with a $40 a ton tax, and that's north of $200 billion. So it's appreciable. My problem with that is that if that were the path followed, it would be completely socially regressive. And I believe that we need to find a way to use those funds primarily to make sure that it is a progressive outcome going forward.
We have a few more minutes left. I want you to just briefly describe this new partnership that you announced with the AFL-CIO around jobs. And is it correct to say that you've been working on this even before the pandemic? And I've noticed some comments among some progressive lawmakers to be a little bit dismissive of jobs in the fossil fuel industry. For example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from New York, she tweeted but then deleted a comment that said she was happy that oil prices had gone negative. Can you talk about why this exists? And my reference or inference from it is that perhaps you're trying to respond to some of the dismissive nature that there has been of some jobs in these sectors.
Well, look, first of all, it's about looking at the jobs overall, okay? But what I would say is issues like stranded workers, stranded communities is really important. It's important for making progress on climate because, my favorite word, and it's in our Green Real Deal, if you want to go to our EFI website, my favorite word in the end is coalitions. We do not accomplish large systemic change very easily without building broad coalitions. And so the labor is one example of an important constituency with any of those constituencies, if we don't bring them along in a coalition, and labor, by the way, 3 years ago, signed, the AFL-CIO signed its commitment to addressing climate change. So, I mean, we are together on that, and we're together on the jobs, because my point was, if we don't have coalitions coming together and pulling together, it always results in political headwinds to the direction we want to go in. If we can pull together labor and business and environmental groups and religious leaders, we could go on, pulling them all together is the way that we can get some tailwinds, because we need them. We are not on a pace that is getting us anywhere near where we have to be in terms of climate. And where we have to be, certainly our commitment, and my colleagues at EFI, we're very clear. It is a net zero economy by mid-century. We desperately need that. We're not on a pace. Again, to get on that pace, we need everybody pulling together.
And in my final question, what is one hopeful thing that you can leave the nearly 400 people that are joining us today online? What is something hopeful that you can share with us? Anything.
Innovation. We have tremendous capacity. We're doing it, and with the right incentives going forward, it's innovation will be our net zero 2050 solution.
Great. Well, Secretary, I want to say thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Amy.
And I hope to see you again soon, whether online or in real life.
Okay, we'll do it.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye.
Bye.